Have you ever noticed how quickly noble ideals collapse when people get scared, tired, or thirsty? Freedom sounds inspiring until resources run low. Faith sounds strong until suffering shows up. Unity sounds beautiful until we meet someone from the wrong tribe at the well. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for the 3rd Sunday of Lent, we'll explore how scarcity tests community, how hardship can forge resilience, and how breaking tribal barriers may be the only way we survive the deserts of our own time. In this episode, we're asking a tough question. Are we waiting for miracles while the well runs dry? Or are we willing to become the source of living water for one another, even in a very fractured world? So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for the 3rd Sunday of Lent, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't require belief in the supernatural. These texts were written by pre-scientific people, shaped by their own cultures, needs, and agendas, not as historic books or scientific manuals, but as meaning-making stories for their communities. And just like believers approach these writings through the lens of faith, I approach them through a more humanistic lens, one grounded in the idea that certain foundational values helped humans evolve and flourish. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, or you might find something completely different. That's the beauty of treating these writings as sacred myth. We're free to negotiate with the text and discover whatever insights we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for the 3rd Sunday of Lent, Cycle A. Our first reading is from Exodus, chapter 17, verses 3 through 7. Our second reading is from the letter to the Romans. It's chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, and verses 5 through 8. And our gospel reading is from John. It's chapter 4, verses 5 through 15, verses 19b through 26, verse 39a, and verse 40 through 42. Now we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages of the main lesson in each one, and finally we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. So with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from the book of Exodus. In those days, the people were thirsty for water, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Our second reading is from Paul's letter to the Romans. Brothers and sisters, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. And we boast in the hope of the glory of God. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, who has been given to us. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And our gospel reading is from John. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." The woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshippers must worship in the Spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. They said to the woman, "We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world." All right, so let's go back and take a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from the book of Exodus. And in this story, the people are thirsty. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. They are physically thirsty. And when survival is on the line, idealism evaporates rather quickly. Freedom from Egypt sounds noble until there's no water. The quarreling at Massa and Meribah reminds us how fragile social cohesion becomes when basic needs aren't being met. Democracy, justice, all this high-minded rhetoric, none of it survives long if people are hungry or dehydrated. And let's be clear, this isn't a failure of faith. This is a reality of human biology. Human flourishing begins with tangible material stability. If leaders ignore that, the social fabric starts to tear. Moses, in this moment, carries the burden of leadership under pressure. Right? The people complain, they panic, they even romanticize Egypt, the very place of their bondage, because nostalgia is easier than uncertainty. That cognitive bias is timeless. When the present feels chaotic, we sanitize the past. We convince ourselves that at least things were stable. A secular reading of this text exposes that danger, retreating into former chains, political, cultural, ideological. Retreating into those former chains does not solve scarcity. It only postpones growth. Mature societies resist nostalgia and instead focus on solving the real problem that's in front of them. In other words, MAGA is an immature response from scared, weak people. Now, let's talk about the rock. The text calls it a miracle. A humanist lens sees something else. Intervention, action, ingenuity. When the desert offers nothing obvious, someone strikes stone and finds water. Whether that's geological knowledge, engineering, or just symbolic storytelling, the message is clear. Solutions require effort. They require us to do something. They require courage under criticism. They require cooperation. You don't pray thirst away. You organize. You problem solve. You experiment. The striking of the rock becomes a metaphor for human creativity in the face of existential crisis. So the main lesson I got from our first reading is that survival depends on our shared courage and collective ingenuity, not on waiting for a miracle. This isn't a story about testing faith. It's a story about testing resilience. It confronts us with a simple truth. Scarcity strains community. Leadership invites pressure, and nostalgia distorts judgment. Survival demands action. Waiting for rescue is passive. Demanding solutions and then working together to create them, that's active. Survival depends on our shared courage and collective ingenuity, not on waiting for a miracle. Our second reading was from the letter to the Romans. And Paul's language here is very theological. Justified by faith, peace with God. But underneath it is a psychological insight that I believe is deeply human. He talks about having peace even in the middle of tribulation. Strip away the divine framing, and what you're left with is perspective. As individuals, families, or even small communities, we can't control droughts or pandemics, economic instability or political chaos, but we can shape our response. Modern psychology and ancient Stoicism, they both affirm this. Peace is not the absence of difficulty. Peace is the disciplined cultivation of inner stability in the face of difficulty. That kind of resilience isn't passive. That's peace, and it's trained, and it's very intentional. This passage then walks us through a progression. Suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope. That's not mystical. That's developmental. Hardship, when it's processed honestly and collectively, strengthens us. It exposes fragility, forces adaptation, and often deepens our empathy. A humanist lens sees this then not as some sort of divine test, but as the secular alchemy of growth. We don't glorify suffering, but we acknowledge that adversity can refine us. Communities that endure together develop trust. Individuals who confront difficulty with integrity, well, they grow moral muscle. Resilience is not something granted from above. Resilience is forged through experience. Then there's the radical claim about love. Love extended even to those who seem unworthy. In religious terms, this is grace. In human terms, this is unconditional dignity. The idea that every person has inherent worth, even when they're flawed, even when their ideas are wrong or cruel. This belief in the inherent worth of every human being is one of the most powerful ethical commitments a society can make. And it's one of the most difficult. It pushes us beyond tribal loyalties. It challenges us to extend compassion beyond our circle. And hope, in this framework, hope is not a wish for rescue. Hope is a rational commitment to the future, a belief that cooperative effort grounded in empathy can actually make things better. So the main lesson I got from our second reading is that resilience is born when we turn shared struggle into an unwavering commitment to one another's dignity. This passage becomes transformative when we shift the focus from divine favor to human solidarity. Peace is cultivated perspective. Character is forged through shared struggle. Love is not selective. Love is a deliberate commitment to the dignity of others. And hope, then, is not fantasy. It is disciplined action toward a better future. But resilience is born when we turn shared struggle into an unwavering commitment to one another's dignity. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of John. And this story begins with tension. A Jewish man speaks to a Samaritan woman, crossing boundaries of ethnicity, religion, and gender all at once. The text even reminds us that Jews do not associate with Samaritans. That line matters. It tells us how deep the division ran. And yet the first act here isn't a sermon, it's a conversation. From a humanist perspective, that's the breakthrough. The simple decision to speak across entrenched lines becomes an ethical act. It challenges the reflex of tribalism and reminds us that progress begins when we see the person in front of us before we see the category they belong to. The woman's question about the correct place to worship, this mountain or Jerusalem, reveals something timeless about human conflict. We love arguing about the right location, the right institution, the right ritual. We build temples and borders and declare them all sacred. But the response from Jesus shifts the focus away from geography and toward integrity. Truth is not confined to a building. Meaning is not owned by any single institution. What matters is authenticity, how we live, how we treat others, how honest we are with ourselves. A secular reading here's a call to move beyond formalism and move toward internal coherence, aligning our beliefs with our behavior. Then there's the metaphor of living water. Water is survival, but here it becomes a symbol for something deeper. The human thirst for meaning, belonging, and connection. We can survive physically and still feel empty. The well in this story becomes common ground, a place where basic needs level hierarchy. And it's striking that the woman, as someone socially marginalized, becomes the messenger who brings insight back to her community. That detail matters. That detail affirms the value of listening to voices that have been historically pushed aside. Wisdom does not flow exclusively from the powerful. It often rises from the overlooked. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that truth is discovered when we set aside our tribal lines and meet one another at the common well of shared humanity. This passage becomes powerful when we stop reading it as a miracle story and start reading it as a human encounter. It teaches us that tribalism is learned, but empathy is chosen. It tells us that institutions can guide us, but they can't contain truth. Or that our deepest thirst is satisfied not by dominance or exclusion, but by connection and shared dignity. Truth is discovered when we set aside our tribal lines and meet one another at the common well of shared humanity. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Exodus, the main lesson I came away with was survival depends on our shared courage and collective ingenuity, not on waiting for a miracle. In our second reading from Romans, the main lesson I got was resilience is born when we turn shared struggle into an unwavering commitment to one another's dignity. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was truth is discovered when we set aside our tribal lines and meet one another at the common well of shared humanity. When you place these three stories side by side, the thirst in the desert, the endurance of hardship, and then the conversation at the well, you can see a pretty clear progression. First, survival. And when resources are scarce and fear rises, the real test is whether we fracture or collaborate. Then, strength. When suffering shows up, the question becomes whether we collapse under it or convert it into character and long-term survival. And finally, connection. Even when our material needs are met, we still ache for belonging. And that ache is healed only when we dismantle the walls that divide us. Together, these readings outline the architecture of human resilience. They show us that deserts, whether physical, emotional, or social, deserts are not transformed by magic, but by how we choose to respond to one another. Our greatest resource isn't a miracle carved into a stone or a monument built to impress. Our greatest resource is the resilient human spirit that can turn hardship into wisdom and can turn strangers into kin. And that's the kind of strength that's worth building. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall, see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what? And now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care about this because these aren't just ancient desert stories. They are survival manuals for a current century that's defined by scarcity, polarization, and burnout. I mean, think about it. We have our own Exodus problem. Climate instability, water shortages, food insecurity, mass migration. We are living in a global desert moment. The dangerous mindset right now is magical thinking, assuming providence, markets, or God will sort it out. A humanist reading of these Bible stories refuses that sort of passivity. If we don't strike the rock through science, engineering, and coordinated policy, the quarreling becomes permanent. Scarcity plus inaction equals collapse. Scarcity plus cooperation equals survival. This is important because tribalism is accelerating. The well in John's story becomes a symbol for what we're missing. Common ground. Today, too many people use faith, nationality, or ideology as a border wall instead of a bridge. Christian nationalism in particular treats identity as a weapon. But our shared thirst for dignity, stability, meaning, connection, that shared thirst runs deeper than those labels. If we don't learn to meet at the well as humans first, we'll keep mistaking loyalty for virtue and division for strength. That's not resilience. That's fragility disguised as confidence. We should care about this because we're exhausted. We are living in a Romans chapter 5 world of collective stress, pandemics, economic uncertainty, political tension. The temptation is to outsource our resilience, to just assume comfort's going to return automatically or that someone else will fix it. Outsourcing our resilience like that, it ain't going to work. We need to step up and do the hard work ourselves. And that takes grit. But grit is built. You can't get it delivered tomorrow from Amazon. Endurance, character, and hope are skills that will take a little grit for us to develop. As we're doing that, let's keep this in mind. Communities that intentionally cultivate perspective, empathy, and mutual support are the communities that endure. Communities that rely on wishful thinking, they eventually fracture. There is no shortcut around the internal work of resilience. And finally, this matters because radical responsibility is not optional anymore. In a globalized world, your water use affects someone else's drought. Your vote affects someone else's rights. Your silence affects someone else's safety. The synthesis of these stories doesn't call us to obedience. It calls us to accountability. We can't afford to be passive observers hoping someone higher up refills the well. We are each other's source of sustenance now. If we don't show up for one another, there is no miracle waiting in the wings. That's why this matters, not as theology, but as a realistic plan for survival. And the last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Well, we've talked about deserts, divisions, and resilience. We've talked about scarcity, stress, and the temptation to retreat back into our own corners. But none of that changes unless it becomes personal. It's easy to critique systems. Hell, I do it all the time. It's harder to examine ourselves. And yet, if resilience is built through action and connection, then it has to start with something concrete in our own lives. So with that in mind, here's your question for the week. Where in my life am I waiting for someone else to bring the water? And what would it look like for me to become part of the solution instead? I think this question matters because it helps shift you from passive frustration to focusing on active responsibility. Maybe you're waiting for leaders to fix the culture. Maybe you're waiting for your workplace to improve morale. Maybe you're waiting for your family dynamics to magically stabilize. Or maybe you're waiting for your own burnout to disappear without changing how you're living. When you identify where you're waiting, you also identify where you have agency. You may not control everything, but you almost always control something. During my first few years at the U.S. Department of Labor, I was working in IT acquisitions. I started as a contract specialist, worked my way up to branch chief, and eventually became the first director of IT acquisitions for the department. Now, on paper, it looked like success. In reality, I was burning out. My team, half a dozen people, was managing over 450 IT contracts with something like a $250 million annual budget. Even as a director, I was personally handling multiple large, complex contracts because we didn't have enough people to do the work. I was getting more than 500 emails a day, sitting in 4 or 5 hours of meetings, and somehow expected to lead strategically on top of all that. It was not sustainable. complained about it a lot at home. One evening, my wife said something she'd said to me before in tough times. If you don't like your current circumstances, then change them. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't poetic. It was just blunt and honest. And it was the nudge I needed. Now, I had already squeezed every efficiency out of our processes that I could think of. I had tried to manage my way out of the overload. Nothing had worked. So instead of waiting for upper management to magically provide more staff or to lighten the load, I started applying for other jobs. I interviewed at other federal agencies. I got referred. I had real conversations about leaving. And word got back to our CIO. One morning, while I was having coffee with another director, she walked in, sat down, and got straight to the point. "I heard you're interviewing," she said. "So we came up with a retention plan." I kind of braced myself for some sort of incremental adjustment or some promise for resources. Instead, she just asked, "What do you want to do?" Now, I didn't quite understand at first, so she clarified, "If you could have any job in this office, what would it be? If there's an opening, I'll put you there. If there isn't, I'll make one." Wow. Well, there happened to be an open branch chief position in customer advocacy, the exact area I wanted to move into. It wasn't a director title, but the grade and the pay were the same. So I took it. Eventually, I became the deputy director and then the acting director for nearly 2 years. That shift didn't just change my job description. It changed my trajectory. And more importantly, it restored my energy. I could have stayed where I was and tried to endure. I watched plenty of peers do exactly that. And yes, resilience sometimes requires endurance, but endurance is not the same thing as passivity. Sometimes resilience means striking the rock yourself instead of arguing about the desert. It means recognizing that while you can't control every condition, you can take responsibility for your response. That decision to act instead of wait, that was the difference between burning out and building something better. So spend some time this week thinking about this question. Where in my life am I waiting for someone else to bring the water? And what would it look like for me to become part of the solution instead? Answering this question builds confidence because it can reveal where you still have power. It builds clarity because it forces you to name the specific problem instead of just feeling overwhelmed. And it builds momentum because once you take even one small step, sending the email, starting the conversation, making the plan, once you take that one small step, you move from spectator to participant. That shift changes how you see yourself. And over time, it changes what you're capable of building. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. American author Maya Angelou once wrote, "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them." Now that's grounded. No mysticism, no miracle language, just plain old human agency. Maya Angelou isn't denying that deserts exist. She's not pretending scarcity, injustice, or burnout aren't real. She's acknowledging them and then drawing a line. You may not control the drought. You may not control the quarreling. You may not control the division in your community or the chaos in the world, but you do control whether those pressures shrink you or strengthen you. That connects directly to the question we just asked. Where am I waiting for someone else to bring the water, and what would it look like for me to become part of the solution instead? Angelou's insight pushes us toward the second half of that question. Being reduced is what happens when we default to helplessness. When we assume someone else had to act first, when we let circumstances dictate our character. Refusing to be reduced means we choose resilience. We choose participation. We choose contribution. And here's why that matters in practical terms. When you stop waiting and start engaging, even in small ways, you interrupt the narrative of powerlessness. You strengthen your own sense of agency. You build psychological grit. You model something different for the people around you. And suddenly, the desert isn't just a place of complaint. It becomes a place of problem solving. You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. This quote doesn't promise rescue. It doesn't promise ease. It promises dignity. And dignity is the foundation of resilience. You may not control the storm, but you absolutely control the kind of person you become inside of it. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week, but in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for the third Sunday of Lent, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that our greatest resource is the resilient human spirit that can turn hardship into wisdom and turn strangers into kin. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV. Copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, and 2011 by Biblica Inc. Used by permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Thank you again for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find the podcast at thecodaproject.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.